Well, this couple wants to select out the carrier gene. How do you feel about that, Mark?
I don't know. I don't see the point. I mean, knowing that you're a carrier might give you a hard time, but it's not painful. I think it would be better to wait until you find someone you want to have kids with, and then get tested to see whether or not you're carriers of any genetic disorders, just like my parents did.
I think that's right. Each and every one of us is a carrier of one or two recessive disorders. It would be impossible to screen out all carriers of everything. I mean, it would be a nonsense. What do you screen out? Who decides what is a good gene or a bad gene? Take deafness, for example. You could select out a gene that causes certain forms of deafness. But some deaf people would choose to remain deaf and would argue for the right of their children to have the chance to be born into a vital and distinctive deaf community.
No offence against deaf people, but I'd be pretty fed up if my parents had a choice as to whether I'd be born deaf or not, and then decided to let me be born deaf.
No, but then you wouldn't have been born. You see, if the fertilised egg that was going to become you contained the gene for deafness, and your parents had selected out deafness, if they had selected a clear fertilised egg that didn't contain the gene for deafness, then you wouldn't have been born. I mean, we're not talking about genetic engineering here. All we're talking about is the selection of one egg rather than another.
All? I mean, what gives us the right to decide who should be born and who shouldn't?
Some people would say that what we're talking about here is going against God's will, going against nature.
And what happens if those people have a headache? They take an aspirin. Is that going against God's will? If they have appendicitis, do they refuse surgery because it's against God's will?
I don't believe in God. But I do believe that what we're talking about goes against nature.
Isn't that what we do all the time in order to stop avoidable suffering?
Quite. Hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, life-threatening illnesses, these are all natural phenomena. Are you saying we shouldn't protect ourselves against the ravages of human nature? I mean, genetic engineering, gene therapy, genetic selection, these are all as natural to us as a species as harnessing the power of fire, of taming animals, cultivating crops, fighting against disease.
But Mum's right. Who decides what's a good or a bad gene?
When we talk about this, someone always comes around to talking about eugenics and Hitler. But we have to be clear that eugenics and genetic selection are not the same thing. In fact, they're quite the opposite. Eugenics it's about coercion from the state, and it's abhorrent. People are afraid of it. They're afraid of coercion, quite rightly so. But what people are not afraid of is the freedom of information and freedom of choice. And it's my job to make sure that people have that information so that they can make an informed choice.
So presumably you think this couple should be allowed to screen out the gene for being a carrier?
If that's what they want. I mean, have faith in human nature, for goodness sake. I mean, if I've learnt anything in my work in genetics over the years, it is that given access to the proper information, people will, by and large, make the right choice in good faith.
But my mother believed that you had made a decision together, in good faith, and then you went against it.
Was it the wrong decision?
And even though this couple's decision might be right for them, how do we know it's right for the human race? I mean, do we really know enough to know what we're doing? Carrying genes for certain conditions can have a positive evolutionary benefit in other areas. For example, many people are carriers of the gene for cystic fibrosis, which protects against typhoid fever.
At this point, I'd like to bring in our studio expert. Professor Burns, some people argue, as I believe Jennifer is arguing, that a decrease in genetic variation could itself be a major threat to the survival of the species, and that this is a reason for not selecting out carriers of genetic disorders. What's your view on this matter?
It's an understandable reaction. It's, if you like, a gut reaction, and it's actually wrong. And in fact, Jennifer gave us the answer to it earlier when she said how many people carry recessive genes. There are almost 500,000 people carry Friedreich's ataxia in this country. And, you know, if even thousands of people have pre-implantation diagnosis and embryo selection, you're really not going to make any real difference to the frequency of that gene over many, many generations. And so it's not actually going to change our genetic makeup very much. But in fact, as as we've discussed before, we've been changing our genetic makeup by using antibiotics, by using vaccines. People who would have died as infants are now growing up to have children. That's changing our genetic makeup very slowly and very subtly. So in fact, the genetic variation will remain. We can't get rid of it, however hard we try. But even if it was diminished, we've long since stopped evolving in that sort of Darwinian sense. We control our family size, and so we don't sort of have 15 kids and hope 2 will make it. You know, we've gone past that. We use medical technology to avoid those devastating diseases. And is that eugenics? Well, in a sense, we are, in a sense, changing our makeup by avoiding suffering and avoiding disease. However, I do actually have some anxiety that Ryan's a little too dismissive of eugenics. Yes, it's easy for us to legislate against having eugenic laws, although it's interesting that back at the beginning of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, of all people, was putting together a eugenics law, as many other countries did, and he was blocked by a libertarian, Josiah Wedgwood, who just didn't like the idea of people having that sort of control, and it was talked out of Parliament. And so, in fact, we've always been a bit nervous about it, and rightly so, because I think what can happen is that eugenics can kind of slide in quietly. It's what I once called the supermarket syndrome, where the thought of taking this disabled baby into the supermarket, people will stare at you and say, why didn't you have a test for that? And people feel obliged to have a test they'd really rather not have. So I think that while I'm not at all worried about the loss of genetic diversity, I'm a little bit worried about the loss of social diversity, that people will become less tolerant of difference.
Thank you, Professor Byrne.